I'm happy to be here with Jay Komarek. It's actually quite a privilege. Jay and I have interacted a lot online, but I've not had the privilege or the benefit of hearing him speak in person. Jay's an icon in our profession. He teaches chiropractors across the world how to work with animals, and he can clarify that in a few minutes for himself. He's a graduate of Western States Chiropractic, multi-generational family of chiropractors, and if I'm understanding correctly, at least 13 chiropractors in the family with assorted others in the periphery.
Right.
And, so Jay is really kind of I would say a poet in terms of the way he approaches animals, his love for animals, his love for caring for animals, and chiropractic in general, which has always intrigued me because I guess I lean towards the romantic side of caring for people, the way you care for animals, and so we'll get into a little bit of that in a minute. But my big interest in interviewing you, Jay, is really for students. I want to direct most of this towards student chiropractors, those that are still in chiropractic college or are just getting out, and maybe get the benefit of some of your wisdom concerning how to hit the ground running when you get out and practice, whether they're working with people or animals, in terms of maybe mental space, mental attitude, also in terms of your view of the science of chiropractic and the clinical side of things. So I had sent you a brief survey that I use in seminars for students. And I use it in the seminars, I ask students to take like an internal survey, how they gauge their self on these in these areas. And basically an internal score, not for public consumption, from 1 to 10, how they see themselves in these areas, or how they gauge themselves in these areas, and then more or less to keep in mind throughout their career. And I always tell them I started way down on the scale for this survey. It's something I created more or less to unpack my own struggles in chiropractic. So I'm going to see if we can maybe, like a lightning round, have you speak to each one of these things, how you see their importance, and why they're important, why students should maybe focus their career on the subluxation and on clinical excellence, but also on the caring aspects of chiropractic care. You got all that?
Great. Thank you. Yep. Thank you.
All
And
right.
thank you for having me. I was excited about doing this.
Absolutely a pleasure. So I'm going to see if I can pull this up on my screen while at the same time still being able to see you. I'm not really tech savvy. Can you still see me well?
Yeah, I'm great. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm reading from this survey that basically is what I call the vertebral subluxation reality score. What value does it have to you? What's the reality of chiropractic in someone's mind? And because I've always said that if you don't own it, you can't sell it. Whether we're talking about anything in healthcare, but in our case, correcting subluxations, the value of correcting the subluxation. So number one, what do you see as the importance of the subluxation itself in the realm of chiropractic?
That's a 10 for me. So, and a 10, as long as it's a 10, when we understand the comprehensive nature of what a subluxation means. That for me, there's many realms of the subluxation. There's the structural realm of the bony displacement. You have the neural realm. You have the myofascial realm. You have just the neuroskeletal realm. Then you have metabolic components and mental and emotional components. And so when you in time, when you grasp how large the concept and the impact of a subluxation comprehensively, it's the focal point of everything we do. And from there, we springboard into a lot of different conversations. And but it all stems from the understanding of a subluxation.
That is awesome. Okay, so next, what would be the value for a student, actually for a young graduate, of being able to explain the subluxation, not only to patients, of course, and being able to educate their patients, but to another chiropractor or to another health professional? How much value does it have, or why does it have value? I should say it that way. Why do you think it has value to be able to communicate the subluxation to the patients and the public in general?
Well, it's today, well, for example, today I was taking care of a horse, and the owner of the horse is an obstetrics nurse, and she was watching visually something happen, which then launched her into what is taking place here. And so we were able to go right to obstetrics, and we were able to go right to the conversation about a baby being traumatized at birth. And, now we're more conscious of that, but vacuum extraction, forceps delivery, cesarean, just traumatic births in general, and how a subluxation started. So the conversation is everything. Your ability to have a conversation start with something, in this case, it was obstetrics. I'm working on a horse, but I knew that she was an obstetric nurse at our local hospital. Mm. And she was watching the horse get adjusted, but the conversation went to subluxation with children or babies. And my gift was to be able to have that conversation in detail with her, and her then being totally hooked and fascinated. I was able then direct her to a book, Birthing the Future by Suzanne Arms, and and that her obstetrics department should be considering the exploration of trauma at birth and how important it is to have a child check. Wow. So in this case, it was not just for her, but it's going to impact that birthing room. So the ability to educate and do it from many levels, for a horse owner, we're talking about maybe a performance. In this case, I was working on a horse that was in a great deal of pain. And so there was a conversation about neural tension. Mm-hmm. And after we had, so it's huge, to be able to explain it and have your languaging match wherever the person is. You have somebody that's educated, someone's very well educated, you're going to then meet them in that model of their world. But it's have your languaging down in conversation from multi-directional, it's really important that,
That really answers my question in more depth than I even realized we were going to go. That's all wonderful. I think you got your finger in front of the screen again.
Okay.
But that actually makes me want to go down a little, and again, your finger's off to the side of the screen. There you go. Okay.
Is that
perfect? Right there.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. And so that makes me think of another little bit of a divergence from the list here, and that is with animals, with horses, dogs, cats, everything that you work on. You're not communicating. It's a nonverbal relationship, and yet you see physiologic changes, you see behavioral changes without the ability to sell the benefits of chiropractic care. So I'm sure you can speak to that. What kind of, you can't ask a horse or an animal of any kind, you can't ask it questions about where it's hurting, and yet you see changes. Can you just speak to that for a minute?
Well, we have there's a whole kind of protocol that we follow, and then there's an assessment, and then post-assessment after the correction of did we in fact make a change. And these things range from neural reflexes, which horses have 7 major reflexes that we can check, which are graded 1 through 4, and we realize that's a really sluggish reflex, and then all of a sudden we have a really sharp reflex that's concurrent with motion. We'll trigger a reflex and the spinal structures will move, and they weren't moving and now they're moving based on a correction. So that, for me, there's this whole protocol of palpation, gait, ranges of motion, neural responses. For the owner watching, I don't have time to go into the explanation of all of this, but what I can tell you is that when people witness an animal adjusted and they see them going from a very high, vigilant, protective, armored state, and we make a correction, and then they come into equilibrium that's dynamic, that they're speechless. Because, for example, today we had several owners who are watching something that's so dramatic, especially with a 1,200-pound horse, and then all of a sudden to see them go docile and tranquil and balanced, and the whole system like a bowl full of Jello as far as dynamic movement, is very impressive. And they realize that something very dramatic happened. If they want to know aspects of it, I tell them, but I don't go into great detail. I always tell people, and students too, like, if I pull a rabbit out of a hat and I'm in a magic show, you really don't want to know how I did that. You just are interested in the fact that, wow, that was pretty impressive. Yeah. And I leave it at that. That I spent my 43 years studying. I still study a great deal. And you're not going to come up to speed with what I spent 43 years studying.
Right.
But in general, yes, something very dramatic happened. It involved the brain, it involved the spinal structures, the musculoskeletal system, and it's good. It's a good thing. So
I maybe summarize, you're talking about going from sympathetic dominance, fight or flight, stress mode, into a balanced, more peaceful state of...
Yeah. I refer to it as dynamic equilibrium. Yeah. You need to be running away from a lion once in a while. You just don't want to live there, right. And I told the woman that she was a nurse today, I said, you can't be digesting your food and running away from a lion at the same time. It's like, you need this ability to be dynamic. That's just the neural end. That doesn't speak to the expression of intelligence. That's just autonomic nervous system being dynamic and doing what it's designed to do. But what precedes that is the fact that there's intelligence there to direct great function. If the system's been traumatized and it's sympathetic, then that's doing exactly what innate wants it to do. And maybe it's dominant. Sometimes we have a dominant sympathetic system that's not going to change. It's hardwired. But 9 times out of 10, we can bring it back into equilibrium. But that's only the neural component of chiropractic. It doesn't speak to the transmission of intelligence, that long before the sympathetics and parasympathetics are kicking in, you have intelligence making decisions as to what's the most appropriate response. That piece that's huge. And, it's very, very difficult for people to grasp that.
Oh, yeah. I hate to say it, but it's oftentimes difficult for us as chiropractors. You've got the experience and the training, but we're talking about young chiropractors, and they're trying to, they've got so many different voices shouting at them. Well, focus on pain and symptoms and orthopedic tests and making money, and they're trying to determine who's the real authority here. And
right.
I think you land in the same place I land from a whole different background, that the focus is not on any of those peripheral things. It's on the person or the animal, their inborn intelligence. You start there. That's the foundation for chiropractic.
Right.
Then
so powerful. I mean, so powerful. And, unfortunately, the schools do the best they can, but we fall short. I'm at many schools. I travel, I speak, and, you're talking with students and you realize, wow, they're really missing big components of what our profession is about, chiropractic is about. So it's our job, your job, my job, to get out there and do the best we can to bring them up to speed,
Absolutely. And as I often say, especially because now these days they get out hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt before they even start life, before they rent an office or buy a table or a desk or get the phone and the lights turned on. I always try to at least get them past the struggles that I had in practice, in order to at least, if somebody's struggling with the same things I struggled with, at least give them insight into those basic fundamentals that I struggled with so that they can hit the ground running. So that leads me to my next question, which is what's the importance? Oh, I'm going to combine these next two. I often ask, how would you score yourself in terms of what's your ability to locate the subluxation? And the next thing I ask is, what's your skill level in analyzing the rotation at that level? In other words, finding subluxation and analyzing subluxation. How important is that to practice? And let me just preface before you answer. To me, so many chiropractors are losing the skill of actually correcting a subluxation, and just kind of throwing their hands up in the air because they've not been taught not only the importance of it, but they've not been given the tools to do that. And so they end up with nothing more than the flying seven, manipulating the spine, crack, 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 up one side and down the other, unfortunately, and lose the magic of actually finding the subluxation and correcting the subluxation and seeing the real physiologic changes. So from your perspective, again, with animals or with humans, how important is actually locating and analyzing subluxations?
That's a big question to unpack, and I have to think about it in terms of stages. That when I initially started practice in '77, was taking an X-ray, I'm using a dermathermograph, and I'm going through this entire procedure. And then over time, I kept refining it, my ability to refine it and locate it and correct it. What happened to me though, because I did upper cervical work for many years in practice, but when I started doing horses, I realized they had a major, either at the sacrum, pelvis, or at the atlas axis. And also a horse has a deep C5, C6, they'll get a subluxation pattern then. Everything else in between to me was joint fixation. There weren't much neural components coupled with that. But at the atlas and axis and the sacrum, and at C5 and C6 in a horse, you can have big distortions. What I found out was that secondary to a subluxation pattern were these major biomechanical faults, which we were just referred to as joint fixation. And as good as I was at correcting the subluxation in a horse, I wound up having to do a shoulder or a scapula or a rib, and that local distortion was creating so much irritation, and it would then recreate a subluxation pattern. So with what I learned with a quadruped, which is not so much the case with humans, was that we had secondary patterns of distortion and compensatory change. There were joint fixations. They have nothing to do with subluxation, but they were secondary compensations that I wound up having to address. And then I had what I thought was a completely clear, when I was done, I realized I'm really done. Horse was clear, subluxation was done, all the secondary issues were addressed. This is particular to quadrupeds. And I saw it in the dog, not as much in the dog or cat, but in the horse is very, very dramatic. And so my skill level progressed over time from using an X-ray to not using as many films, although I still send people for MRIs and and X-rays weekly. And but it then progressed. I didn't use a heat reading instrument. My palpation skills are excellent, but took me 43 years to develop palpation. And it came in stages, it just kind of surface level, then deep, more deeply. of feeling, oh, that is rotated to the left, that is rotated to the right. What happened though, which I don't like discouraging people from films now, because I realized my first 20 years that I was taking films, and then I was doing I had the films up on the box, and I'm looking, it's like, oh, that's what that feels like.
Right.
And I had thousands and thousands of people where I could feel that, and I knew exactly what that X-ray should look like.
Right.
And so I realized I had that under my belt, and as I got to the point where I knew exactly what I was going to see, I kind of fell away from using as many films. I still do it, but I didn't need it as much. I didn't need the heat reading instrument. I got to a point where after using the dermathermograph, I mean, it was 16 years, 4 days a week of 100 people a day, I knew when they were clear and when they weren't. And they would bring me back the postgraph. I realized I knew I hadn't cleared them. And then I knew when I would get a clear graph. And so all these things were progressive, and I think it's all important initially. And I think over time, as you sharpen your skill set, things fall away. I know I don't use X-ray like I did in my first 20 years, and I don't use a heat reading instrument, although on occasion I do. I have a infrared reading instrument for the horses. And so I don't know if that answers your question.
There was a day in our profession when they would try to package, you can't give somebody experience that doesn't have experience, but they would package the experience of the instructors, the professors, chiropractic instructors, and try to give students at least exposure to that wisdom. But these days, the chiropractic education has, because of the CCE, has leaned so heavily into diagnosis, pathology, veered away from really chiropractic skills, that unfortunately students are having to get a secondary education in seminars like your own. And so that was an excellent. I like that because it's very honest. You really can't hand somebody that experience that took you so much hard work and struggle, but it's worth the effort to master this skill.
That part is something that's very satisfying, and in that when someone comes in who's suffering or struggling, and they may be subluxated, very good likelihood, and I know exactly what to do for that, and without saying it and overstating it or boasting, but realizing I've seen 1,000 of those, I've seen 100 of those, and I know exactly what to do. And they're looking at you and you're like, on the table, let's get you checked and get adjusted. Right. And then to see the results. I had a woman who brought a dog down. I posted a picture. She drove 6 hours to bring a dog down from Oregon to be adjusted. She was going to fly to Boulder. So it happened I was in California. I adjusted the dog twice. It was the fifth cervical, just like with the horse. They get a deep posterior fifth cervical. She had hit the brakes. The dog went flying into the windshield, flexed its neck, and the fifth cervical popped. And so anyway, long story short, I adjusted the dog twice. I checked the dog 2 additional times with no adjustment. There was nothing necessary, which was as important as the first 2 adjustments where force was introduced. And she said, aren't you going to do anything? There's nothing to do but wait. That's awesome. Just be patient. And sure enough, she sent me on Monday morning, which was Friday, Saturday, Sunday, 4 days later, a picture of the dog running around. The dog was ataxic, dragging its legs. So, that in 4 days' time, the dog had been that way since June. This was just 10 days ago. 7-8 weeks of dragging its legs and have it functional in 4 days. But I knew it when she described what had happened. Right. When she said, I knew, I can fix that. And I knew it was related to subluxation.
Confidence,
the only thing that could do that.
Confidence from experience is invaluable. But in terms of those that, again, don't have the years of experience, I always say when I have the opportunity to speak that the post check is worth the price of admission, because my confidence comes not from the patient's immediate symptomatic changes, even though you get a lot of that in practice, especially with pain syndromes. Sometimes people that are even in chronic pain, it amazes me sometimes. They get off the table and say, wow, I've been dealing
Yeah.
with this for 6 months or 2 years and I already feel better. But beyond pain relief, you've got the long-term benefits that you're not going to necessarily see. They may feel better in a week, 2 weeks, a month, and whether or not they come back, to have the confidence to say, I know I made a correction. Again, the
Yeah.
post-check is worth the price of admission is my favorite saying.
Yeah.
All right. So, which I loved your answer, because again, the experience speaks for so much. But anyway, let me move on here. So, how important, and this is exactly what we were just talking about, is someone's confidence in the value of correcting subluxation. In other words, when someone corrects a subluxation, a chiropractor corrects a subluxation, you have confidence that you corrected it with your post check. And how important is that to you? Actually, you just said it.
Well, the post check, but there are components of the post check that are very significant to me, and for the horse and for the human, the primary characteristic for me is breath. That all of a sudden I watch the respiratory wave increase, or I watch a horse. That happens 99% of the time, and with a human, you'll see them sigh. And
Absolutely.
I realized that was the indicator of ease in the central nervous system.
Especially with C1. Especially with C1, right?
Yeah, C1. Yeah, of course. So you have that component of breath, which is the pump of life that's bringing in the prana, the energy, which is charging the system. And that when I see that open, then that my palpation of symmetry, of ranges of motion, tonal qualities, leg check, all those things are really important to me. But breath for me in the horse is, and with human too, is my number one indicator of, oh, I'm there, or on my way there. And
yeah, I love that.
Breath is everything for me.
Yeah, and how many patients don't see that they're making that sighing noise, and you see it yourself, but with humans, but so many people do remark. They get off the table and immediately say, gee, I feel like I can breathe better. It's probably the number one thing people do say after a C1 adjustment. So yeah, that's really powerful. They don't make that same noise the horses make.
No.
Thank goodness.
Yeah.
All right. So that brings me to the second to the last one. And this again speaks to experience. How important is the expertise at sorting out individual variables? People and animals are individuals, and not only different emotions and differing thresholds for pain, differing their awareness is different, their consciousness is different, and so you're getting out with this education and maybe textbook knowledge of what to do, when to do it, how to do it, but then you've got to work with people or animals that are very much individuals. And how important is being aware that even the psychology is somebody that walks into my office after years of being in practice, you start to interact with them differently. And I'm sure that absolutely the same has got to be true with animals.
Yeah, there's I call them rapport skills, and then mirroring and matching tones, and especially with people. The number one thing is knowing who you are as a human being, and integrity and honesty being at the forefront of your communication. That, we in this profession is wrought with, where we're kind of taught by management groups, where we're overstating something, although it may be true for some chiropractors, it may not be true for the chiropractor who's stating it, just because they don't have the experience, if that makes sense. That is, we make these statements that we've overstated something, rather than just being honest, I'm going to work with you. I'm going to need you to trust me. We're going to have a process initially, then we're going to move through another level of care and on to long-term lifetime care. And, so for me, the communication begins with honesty and integrity and not overstating what we do. That is, now for me, when somebody walks in and I say, I can help you, I'm saying it based on my experience over time. But after a year or two of practice, you may not be able to say that. But I'm going to do my best based on my level of skill sets to assess and correct a subluxation. The rapport is, for me, if your willingness to be honest is fully, totally vulnerable and honest about where you are in practice, it precedes everything. And after that,
if I can interpret what you're saying, and I may be misinterpreting it, even though I love what you're saying, in a sense, we all have to be leaders or authority figures in terms of helping people and serving the public. And yet, as a young person, new graduate, your personal confidence, not only in your skills, but in your, I just remember just not having the social skills. I was a very social person, but I didn't necessarily want to take the role of a leader, and I was very clumsy, very awkward in that role. And so, like, again, you can't transfer that from someone that's got experience to someone that doesn't. But how does a young person, a young graduate who doesn't necessarily just have that personal confidence? I watched another young graduated the same time I did, just brought his self-confidence right into practice, and just his practice just grew exponentially immediately. There are those standouts, but most of us, yeah. So how does somebody, I almost see it as what you're talking about as humility, you're talking about honesty, but honesty not just with the person, but honesty with yourself. How do you get there?
Well, I think, one, just recognizing that is of huge value, to not overstate something. And, you begin with that. Secondary to that is your education. That you may go take a neurology program, or you take a muscle palpation program, and you learn something, and it's consistent with what you studied in school, and you bring that to the practice on Monday morning, and and you're sharing something you learned educationally. That goes a long way, so that you're sharing the skill set that you're learning and you're mastering. So education, in addition to the humility and integrity and not overstating what we're doing based on where you are in practice, the rest is your enthusiasm about a particular study. For me, it's neurology. I love neurology. I take the Komarek programs. I love that. And so I'll take one piece of that, and I'll bring it into practice, and I'll share that. And I'm saying something that somebody else taught me. But it's educational, and it's fact, and it's based on their body function, and I'm sharing that. And so it's not based on so much the experience of what I'm doing. I'm just sharing knowledge about the brain or the spinal cord or the neuroskeleton or the meninges, and they're, I'm wowing them with knowledge, not so much about like, look what I know how to do, or this is what I do. Although I share that on occasion, but most of it's just information based. State good information that you're learning, to be true. And I think people love that, especially when it's centered on brain, spine, but muscle.
So you're bringing me to another point that, again, I struggled with, and this is maybe, years ago, this used to be hard for me to admit, but now I can more readily admit it. I struggled with empathy when I was first in practice. Like there's a lot of female chiropractors now, and they seem to be a little bit more naturally empathetic. But getting outside of myself and caring about somebody else and their problems, I mean, not just their pain, but their life problems, and really listening and valuing them and trying to lift them up. I see that as so critically important. But again, it's not a skill that you learn. It's almost like something you've got to be aware of and be deliberate about. If someone is like me and just was young and self-focused, self-centered, and now you're working with people that are needing someone to care about them, needing
Well,
someone to encourage
we
them.
need to keep in mind that at the medical schools, they're teaching these, super intellectual people compassion skills. They actually have to go through a class and courses on compassion. So, the fact that it doesn't naturally come to us, some of us, it's common that, to be with someone who's suffering, really legitimate suffering of somebody who's struggling, whether it's mental or physical. It takes a lot of humility. You've got to be humble, and you have to be able to stay with someone. And it doesn't mean time-wise, but when they're in that place, I'm not there to fix that or try to make it go away, but I'm okay being with someone who's just lost a child or someone who's just been diagnosed with cancer. I'm okay being with them. And I've learned that over time. And I always just use the word stay. I'm going to stay. I'm not running. I'm not going to jump ship. So the second thing, with that in mind, you can still be compassionate without spending 20 minutes.
Right.
We always joke about, when I turn on the light switch and I hit the light switch, I don't stand there rubbing the plate after I'm done. The light's turned on. I know I'm good. I love you. See you Wednesday. And, you can still have a whole lot of compassion. And whether it's 30 seconds or 5 minutes, but it doesn't require an hour visit to demonstrate compassion.
Right.
So, it's a hug, it's the look of the eye, it's maybe the touch of your hand on their shoulder.
Or just listening.
Just listening.
And that again, that's wonderful. Let me just so the summary of the survey that I present to students or young chiropractors is basically, how do you gauge your willingness to work for a perfect score? Nobody's a perfect person or a perfect practitioner. It doesn't matter how many years of experience or knowledge you have. But what's your drive, your passion, and how big is that?
Well, first off, it's a wonderful question. I always, my whole thing is always ask better questions of yourself. That in itself is a wonderful question because it, I don't know what the right word for this, but it sets the stage for you doing a good job. That at the end of this visit, I'm going to gauge how involved was I, how comprehensive was I in my thinking, my approach, my adjustment, my post check. And with a horse, you can't get away with anything less. So the horse demands it of me. That and I'm waiting for these certain responses, and I realize if I'm not perfect or near perfect, as Sid Williams would say, if I'm not near perfect in my approach, I'm not going to get the result that I want. And I'm not trying to satisfy them. I'm trying to satisfy my own parameters that I've set for the work that I do. And I have to say that that's what's kept me inspired all of these years, that just to watch a great response, whether it's a human or a child. I adjusted 2 kids going off to college. One was going to Barcelona, one was going up here to Colorado, and it was brother and sister one. And they were so excited to be adjusted before they were leaving. And the response was this joyfulness of these 2 kids who I know who are now going away, and they were getting cleared out before they left. And it's really incredibly satisfying to do that, just on a personal level, let alone the physiology of it all.
So, for me, again, after all my years in practice, the things you're saying not only resonate as true, but you're really summarizing it certainly better than I can summarize it. So I'm hoping that, again, young docs, young graduates can take that away from this and kind of emulate that. I know that you do a lot of presentations throughout the world, and I'm just in a few days, Mile High is coming up, and you guys have some kind of culinary session on Saturday morning for those that are attending Mile High there in the Denver area with Danny Knowles. Just explain what it is you're going to be covering.
We have, there were a couple things happening. I was with a good friend of mine, Dr. Ken Harris, and we belong to a men's group called Mankind Project. And some of the men in the group that we're in realized, wow, there's so much information from people who've been in practice for a long period of time, and which we refer to as eldering or saging. That is, you've got 40 years, you've distilled down certain, not all of it, but in your given area of expertise, you've distilled down information, and there's a morsel of truth there that would take you 40 years to figure out. And that we shouldn't be letting that go by the wayside.
Absolutely.
That the elders, and whether it's in our families of the elderly, my dad at 90 or my mother at 90, and them dispensing information, or us doing it as elders of 40 plus years of practice. And let's put that out there, and let's do a panel. So Donnie Epstein, myself, Ken Harris, Bob DeBonis, Stephen Shargal, and Armand Rossi. We will have, it's men, this particular group, just because we were part of the Mankind Project men's group. We are including women in the next round, should we get that far. But we, as men, we were trying to figure out our stuff so that we were good at what we were doing and what we were really up to. We wanted to be, we wanted to have both genders, but we initially needed to work out and iron out our own kinks. So this first presentation is with 6 men. The next presentation will include the women into our group, and we will then spend another year cultivating our conversation. So the group on Saturday morning will be answering questions of students. Tomorrow will be given a postcard on Friday, postcard to put their questions on, and there will be a moderator asking the questions. And as a group, we will then field them, whoever is called to do that, based on our, so.
Sharing your wisdom. So now just going to take a different turn because we're about to wrap up. Just wanted to ask you and I didn't tell you I was going to do this, but a personal anecdote. I know a little bit about your background, not a lot, but you got your hand. There you go. Your dad was a chiropractor there in France, right? So
my dad was a chiropractor outside of Philadelphia, in Bristol,
okay.
Pennsylvania, for many years, and his brother was in Morrisville, and they did mostly steelworkers from U.S. Steel. This was in the late 50s, 60s, 70s. And then when I graduated, my father moved to France with my mother. And then he would come back and work with me over the years, but I ran both practices. My uncle passed, and I bought my uncle's practice, and I bought my father's practice. As Europeans, nothing was handed to you. They were like, no, you're going to work for this. And I have 5 sisters, and they both felt, look, it's not fair that we should give something to you. The money that I purchased the practices were funneled back to my sisters. And so that's how that worked. That was the way they...
Give me one fun or whatever interesting personal anecdote that maybe you share in your seminars, or maybe don't. Just something that stands out to you from your dad's time in practice or your uncle's time in practice. Probably a million stories.
It's probably, as far as watching them, my father, if you missed an appointment with my father, you were in serious trouble. So I'm going to use some language here that maybe you're going to want to cut out. But my father helped. There was a patient, and his name was Gene, and he was hit by an elderly man, and in a T-bone, and the car rolled, and it turned out that the elderly man died, and Gene was strapped in the car. They had to get him out with jaws of life, but he was looking at this dead individual, this elderly man, until they got him out. And what the shock and the trauma and the subluxation, he couldn't sleep for a year, that this picture of this man's face kept popping into his head. So his wife was my patient, And we were on a rotation. I got a new patient. My dad got a new patient. I got one.
Mhm.
My father got Gene Kehoe. My father started adjusting him, and he cleared him out. It was upper cervical issue, cleared him out. And after like a month of care, which he was, whatever the schedule was, my father had him on, he started sleeping. All of his functions started coming back. All of his exam findings were excellent. And Gene disappeared on my dad for a couple of weeks. My dad had him on weekly or bi-weekly, whatever it was. We had a reception room that sat 40 people. It was a very big reception area. And Gene showed up about a month later after missing several weeks. And my father, one of the assistants went into the back, said, "Dr. John, Gene Kehoe is in the reception area." And he said, "You just keep him out there." And my father was Czech. He had a very strong Czech accent. And he walked, my father was always in a suit and a tie, dressed to the nines, walked out into the reception area. And he said it so the way you were speaking initially when you were first on the conversation, and it's your Italian coming out. My father, when he wanted to raise his voice,
Right.
my father said it, and he did it intentionally so that all 20 or 30 people in the reception area heard him. Said, "Gene Kehoe, you dirty bastard." He said, "If you ever miss an appointment with me again, I'm going to come over there and I'm going to kick you in the balls." The entire waiting room, you could hear a pin drop in the wait. My father could care less. He didn't care. He was already in his late 70s. But after I just helped you of you not sleeping, you missed a couple weeks. Are you freaking nuts?
Right.
And my father, when he got him in the back, read him the riot act in the room.
Right.
That guy never missed. He wound up referring us tons of people. He never missed another appointment. But my father, that's the way he meant. You come to get your subluxation corrected. You follow my instructions. And I'll tell you when you can go to once a month or every 2 months, but you didn't get to decide that on your own.
Wow.
And so it was a little crass, but let me tell you, none of those people ever missed an appointment in that reception area. And the staff was there with their mouth agape, because it was so brusque. And,
Yeah.
But
it brings the conversation full circle, because that sort of confidence and authority, it can only be, what's the word I'm looking for? Authentic. You can't pretend to have that kind of confidence or authority. It comes from, again.
My father knew the value of a subluxation. My father knew that guy would have suffered for the rest of his life with a psychological disorder or emotional disorder, and then who knows what would have happened. But he also knew that he corrected it and brought this kid back into balance. And my father and my uncle both, I mean, they were fierce about defending subluxation, and their understanding was bar none. I mean, my father had green books that were underlined page after page.
Wow.
And he had one of those pens that had red, blue, green that you could push the little thing,
Right.
page, asterisk, underline, asterisk, underline. And they were both very, very studious.
That's wonderful. So that is just the perfect summation, and also leads me to the very last point I'll ask you to make: the value of philosophy in chiropractic. I know a lot of people in a lot of schools are saying it's antiquated, yet there was even though maybe some of the language is antiquated. They saw something. BJ Stevenson. They saw something when they looked at the body that talk about a kernel of truth that really is the foundation of chiropractic still today. So I'm going to ask you to bring this to a conclusion before we say goodbye by explaining that to young students and chiropractors.
Yeah. The philosophy is the glue that holds the mechanics together. It doesn't make any sense. The power of chiropractic, the exponential power, is based on the philosophy coupled with your understanding of anatomy and physiology, and that a subluxation can biomechanically exist. But the glue of knowing and the understanding of knowing that intelligence is at work. This is ephemeral. We don't have a way to quantify the intelligence.
Right.
We just know that it happens. We see the effect of it. So your confidence, your ability to state something is saying, I don't know. I know that healing takes place, and I know it because of an intelligence in the body that animates all the structures. That when you're able to state that, and in addition to having the mechanical aspects of giving a corrective spinal adjustment for subluxation, that's a powerful thing. You'd be hard pressed to go find a book on physics today that doesn't discuss intelligence. So when you talk about consciousness and you talk about intelligence and it animating matter, that's in all physics texts. You go listen to any physics professor, they have to necessarily talk about intelligence in matter, and that there's more energy and intelligence there than there is hard stuff. So the fact that students haven't caught up, it takes a great deal of time and energy to study all of that, start piecing it together. But our philosophy is on very, very solid ground. And if you don't realize it, it's just that you're not up to speed on what's out there, in physics primarily, but it's also in biology and it's in neurology. We know. So
students should really avail themselves of our founding philosophy.
Yeah, without question. Yeah. And the 33 principles can be, Dr. Koch. We have our Koch. David Koch. He did a really nice job, made some nice changes, but those primary principles really set the stage for a wonderful practice. And yes, we can add to them. Yes, they can be updated. There are one or two that are maybe possibly a little faulty, but in general, like, they're pretty solid. Yeah. And so you got to have that. It's the glue that holds it all together.
I think the takeaway I'm getting from all this is I want to be Jay Komarek in order to be a good chiropractor.
What a nice compliment. That's a very, very, very nice compliment, Nick. Thank you.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. I'm really hopeful that this records as well as it came across, because it's been a wonderful interaction. Yeah.
Well, thank you for having me. Really a joy. Still, after all these years, still a joy to me to talk about chiropractic. I'm going to have dinner with a chiropractor tonight. You know what we'll be talking about? Subluxation.
That's awesome. Do you care to say who it is?
It's Dr. Harris.
Oh, Ken, say hello. So, I met him down at Sherman's Lyceum. I think this past year I was speaking down at Sherman, and really cool guy.
Pretty amazing guy. This is it'll be a repeat of what you and I just did.
Yeah, that's so awesome. Yeah. All right, so those that just one last thing, just a matter of administration or detail. If somebody wants to get a hold of you for your program or just to chat with you personally, how do they do it?
jkomarek.com. It's Komarek, or jkomarek@gmail.com. It's jaykomarek@gmail.com, or 970-975-0744 is my personal cell phone. You're welcome to call if you're struggling or stuck.